Welcome, my friends, to the Far Post Podcast, presented by Esports Gaming League. I'm Jeff Lemieux, and today I have fantastic news for the three of you who have occasionally tweeted at me over the course of the past year and a half asking, when are you guys getting back to the standard Far Post podcast format? I get one of those tweets every 4 or 5 months or so from really dedicated fans. Well, let me tell you, the time has come as we continue to move a bit more towards normalcy. The Far Post podcast now moving back towards normalcy as well. We're not totally back to normal because Elizabeth Pahota, who has been co-hosting the show remotely with me for the past year and a half or so, she is not with us today. She's traveling for a wedding this weekend, but she'll be back with us on the next show. But I am joined today, very excited, by Cathal, Conlon, and Jason Dalrymple. I know not a lot has happened over the course of the past year and a half, so I'll just ask probably quick answers from both of you. How are you guys doing?
Good. I have 2 quick disclaimers. I did not force Elizabeth out. That's a coincidence. So there was no power grab. That is just a coincidence. And my second point would be the word is normality, not normalcy.
You've been trying to
but
get
it's
me...
great to be back.
You have been trying to teach me that over the course of the past year and a half, and I can't quite seem to grasp it. But the good news is, obviously, I did spend the last 18 months or so really honing in on how to pronounce your name.
And you nailed
it. Finally got it, Cathal.
You nailed it, Cathal, yes. You did.
Finally,
you crushed it.
It took me 18 months isolated alone in my apartment to finally just really every day, all day, every day, how do I pronounce this dude's name? And it's Cathal. We've been saying it wrong the whole time.
But it's good, though, because everybody's taken something from COVID, right? People learned a new skill or something. I spent my time like getting into cocktail making, right? You know, and you did it pronouncing my name correctly, which is great. So good for you.
Yeah. Congratulations
to me.
well
done, you.
Yeah, Jeff.
Jason, I still don't know how to pronounce your name. I'm going to be perfectly honest. But
yeah, it's why everyone just calls me J Dal and not my last name, because I'm not even going to pronounce it.
It's true.
How about that?
It's true. It's pretty tough. But first and foremost, most importantly, since you haven't been on the show in a while, family's happy and healthy. Everybody good to go.
Everyone's great.
Yes.
No complaints.
Yes.
I got no complaints in the real world. We are a lot of people in worse spots than I am.
Fair. We should note, and we do have video of today's podcast as we record, and most people, a lot of people who are kind of diehard Far Post podcast fans have probably seen you somewhere over the course of the past year and a half, a photo on social media, but you have not cut your hair in a long time.
That's true. That is true. Yes, that is true. It is flowing. Yes. It started off as obviously initially it was just because you couldn't. And then it sort of became a challenge, and now it's almost that Oliver hates it. So it's just sort of to antagonize him, which is fun. Well, I haven't cut it in a long time. So we're just going to see how it happens.
I say there's no plan at the moment. It's basically just one day you're going to wake up and say, you know what, maybe today's the day.
Exactly. There's no concrete plan. We're just going to write it out and see what happens.
Is this the longest it has ever been by far?
In the history of my life. There was a time period where it was sort of shaggy, but it got to like sort of top of my ears and it was shaggy and long on the top, but it was always short and on the bottom and the sides. It's never been this sort of flowy business. Has never happened before.
Would you believe me if I told you that in college I had hair that was approximately that length?
I would not believe that, no.
You shouldn't believe it. It's true.
Did not happen.
But you also shouldn't believe it. I should note, too, we're recording today for the first time in the digital studio at the Revolution Training Center, and I love that we have this space. It feels incredibly legit. I love it for the team. I love it for our digital department. But for the Far Post, it just feels like it's almost too legit for us. Like we have punched above our weight for so long.
It sounds really crisp as well.
Yeah.
It's like it feels like we've broken into the building and we're just trying to get it recorded before anyone knows we're in here.
Yeah.
It's nice.
That's why we shut the door. When we had the door open a crack, everyone who walked by would kind of peer in and be like, I don't think those guys are supposed to be in there.
Like, who's in there today?
Yeah, who are those guys? Riffraff.
Yeah, who knows what's going on in there?
This is nice.
It is
nice, yeah.
It does sound, I obviously have a great voice for this kind of thing. I just always have,
You should do wildlife shows.
Yeah.
You should. You should take over for like David Attenborough when he finally retires. He's like 110 now, so it's probably close. You should take over those Planet Earth shows.
It is still jarring. You do it for however many years, but to hear your voice kind of echoing through the headphones and the microphone, like, oh,
yeah,
that's pretty legit.
A couple of things I would like to say off the top of the show. One, thank you and good job keeping the show alive during this lockdown period. Yeah.
We changed the format up quite a bit,
You
obviously.
did, but you had to.
Became
right?
a long-form interview with a player
Yeah,
every week,
you had
essentially.
to, but you kept it going. And so good job, you and Elizabeth.
Appreciate
Very
it.
proud of you both for keeping the show going. And I would offer an apology because you had a fairly tangent-free show for about 16 months. You didn't really get sidetracked. You stayed very professional and on topic, and that is out the window, my friend. That is gone.
We spent 18 months building a track
Yes.
just so we could now finally have the opportunity to veer off that track.
Yes.
Because we've been on the track
Yes.
for quite a while.
I am behind the wheel, and we're going to get lost.
People will notice as well. We do have a soundboard
Yeah, and
back.
it's mainly because we got our soundboard back.
Yeah.
It's just,
Yeah.
Yeah, the soundboard does it sends things off the rails occasionally, but
it does, and it wasn't the same just doing that over Zoom. It's like this. No, it's just not. I don't know. Just didn't hit the same,
Yeah.
Yeah.
But good job, Jeff. Good job keeping us going.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Like I said, there have been 3 or so people who've been just absolutely clamoring for us to get back to this
that's
format,
mostly
so.
my family with burner accounts.
Yeah.
But, job done.
Yeah,
We're going to make 3 people happy today.
Yep.
For sure, for sure.
But, I mean, it's 2 more than I made happy yesterday, so I'll take it.
This is good. Good.
There you go. We typically do like to keep things pretty light on the Far Post podcast, which you'll know if you've listened to us at all over the course of the past decade or so. I'll be honest, that's something of a challenge today because a very good friend of ours and a legendary figure within the New England Revolution organization, and more importantly, to be honest, a legend in life, Paul Mariner, sadly passed away peacefully this past Friday after a brief battle with brain cancer. Paul was, of course, an assistant coach to Steve Nicol from 2004 to 2009, was part of that coaching staff that led the Revs to 3 straight Eastern Conference championships in 05, 06, 07, kind of the heyday of that group. Was also the Revolution's color commentator alongside Brad Feldman for 6+ seasons. So spent more than a decade as part of this club. He is woven into the fabric of this club's history and this organization. But something we never even really talked about a ton, he also had an incredible playing career with some of the biggest clubs in England. Scored 13 times for the England national team, including at the 1982 World Cup. And I'll be honest, normally I would dread a conversation like this because we all miss Paul so terribly, and we are so sad that the world, not just us, but the world has lost such a bright light, and one of the brightest lights that I have personally ever come across. But I do think that the last thing Paul Mariner would want is for us to sit around and be somber and sulk as we remembered his life. That just wasn't who Paul was, and he would be so disappointed, I think, if he knew that's how we were celebrating him, and he'd want us to laugh and joke and smile. So that's what we will try to do to the best of our abilities. Obviously, I can't promise there won't be some emotional moments as we talk about Paul, but we'll try to keep it as happy and remembrance as we can, because that's what Paul would want. And I think no conversation about Paul Mariner would be complete without hearing from his longtime partner in the Revolution broadcast booth, and I think more importantly, his longtime friend, Brad Feldman, who joins me now via phone. And Brad, obviously we all had our relationships with Paul. We've all known him for quite a long time, but I did want to start by saying, first, I send particular condolences to you because I know the two of you were so close, not just from your time together in the broadcast booth, but also from Paul's time as a coach here. So tremendously sorry for your loss, and thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
Thank you for having me on, Jeff, and thanks for the good words. You guys all knew him well, and I think it's been pretty clear over the last few days how many lives he touched, how many people had great friendships with him, both people who were very close to him and even people from afar who felt like they knew him because he projected his personality and really cared about people the way he did. It was genuine, that he touched so many lives. And I think that that's one of the things that made it the grieving process easier for me. I'm a talker both by nature and by profession, but in this case, I think talking about Paul, his personality, his legacy, and all the laughter and adventures is a really good way to, because if I don't look down, then I don't stop to think about the reality of it. And I know there are people, his family members, his partner Val, who are suffering a different way than I am. And he had so many teammates and colleagues and former players that I'm hardly alone. But I do appreciate the good words. I will say this: I was in England when it happened this past weekend when he finally passed, and I watched the Euro final in a big outdoor tent, hundreds of people at long tables. And when the BBC pregame tribute to Paul, that you may not have seen, I don't know if it's been posted on YouTube or the BBC website, but Gary Lineker was anchoring it and said some very meaningful words, and also they showed sort of a compendium of clips of him playing, and that's when both the reality of his being gone really hit me, but also like the enormity of what he meant over there. To see that tribute in that context with all those other people, and that's when it really hit me right between the eyes, and I was glad that I was surrounded by people who were close to me at that moment, because that was hard. But talking to guys like you about him makes it a lot better for me personally. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, of course, we're happy to provide the opportunity. And I think kind of what has stood out to me most over the course of the past week or so is obviously anytime anyone passes away, you always hear all of these tributes and people say all of these kind, thoughtful words about people after they've passed away. But with Paul Mariner, everything feels so genuine. I legitimately don't think at any point throughout Paul's life I ever ran into anyone who had any sort of interaction with him. You mentioned whether it was a fleeting interaction or whether they knew him well. I don't know anyone who ever said a bad word about Paul Mariner. I'm not sure if there's a better way to kind of sum him up than the fact that everyone who came across him came away with a perception of who he was and kind of that bright light that he had.
I can't remember who it was. There was somebody who was interviewed, a former player from his era who's a little younger, who told a story about a game where he had to mark Paul Mariner, and Paul broke his nose with an elbow during the game, but then afterwards was really encouraging to him and his parents and said, the guy's got a bright future. He's like, I love Paul Mariner, even though he broke my face.
Well, it feels like that sums him up in a way too, where I'm interested to know kind of what it was like working with Paul in the broadcast booth, because it seemed, at least from the outside, that he took everything he did incredibly seriously, whether it was his playing career, whether it was his coaching career, whether it was his work in the broadcast booth or as a pundit. Everything he did, he took incredibly seriously, but without taking it too seriously. And I don't know if I hope that makes sense to people, and I think people who know Paul kind of understand that. But he was very, very ingrained in his work and was serious about it. But it seemed like with always that lighter side of not taking things too seriously.
Well, I think you almost have to. Everybody has their own approach to life, and we all come from different backgrounds. But anybody who's a world-class striker like he was obviously has a healthy dose of ego and self-confidence. You want that in your center forward, but his ego and the way he sort of his sense of self relative to that ego, I think, is different from what you see in a lot of athletes today. And it's not an indictment of them, but he came from such a different background. And I think also felt so grateful to have the opportunities and success that he had, even while taking pride in what he earned with his own, hard work, blood, sweat, and tears, that he, his whole thing, it wasn't a false modesty. It was just, there are no airs, there are no pretenses. And he, also knew what worked. He, played for coaches like Sir Bobby Robson, who had a similar ethos where, you get run into the ground in training, and these guys, on the Ipswich teams of the late 70s, early 80s were playing, 90 minutes, 60, 65 games a season because they were in Europe and the FA Cup as well. But then away from the game, after work, you had a beer in the hot tub, you had a laugh at the pub, and it built camaraderie. And so to him, it was very genuine because that was the sense of self he had, and B, in a team or organizational context, whether it was an actual football club or a broadcast team at the Revs or ESPN, the model for success that he knew that he had succeeded with as a player coming up was one where personality and bonding and humor played a big role. I know Stevie Nicol had a similar philosophy because if you're gripping the wheel too tight, you make tension mistakes. But if, you play with confidence that comes from trust, that comes from knowing the guy next to you and wanting to do well with them instead of being in competition with them or worrying about making mistakes, then you're going to play better or announce better or whatever it is that you're doing. And so I think the whole thing with him is, was that it came from a natural place. It didn't always pay dividends. Like one of the local broadcasters for one of the stations tried to dub him Sir Paul Mariner as a nickname. Now, Paul used that trope, he called him, Sir Robert for Bobby Shuttleworth or
yeah.
Sir Robert or Roberto Abramowitz, the NYCFC and ESPN broadcaster. But it didn't sound right when the guy started saying it. And I know I talked to Cathal about it too. In Paul's particular case, the guy scored in the World Cup, 35 appearances for England, won the FA Cup. You would think somebody like him might have a peerage, a title. Several of his England teammates from that 82 team did get, whether it was a knighthood or a lower order, I don't know peerages in England very well, but Paul wasn't Sir Paul. Not by design, but by nature. Yeah. He probably dropped a few many F-bombs around the royal family to get knighted. You know what I mean? But he had this, we don't need no stinking badges approach to life. He was a maverick. But it wasn't out of defiance or spite. It's just who he was. He was an honest broker all the way through.
And because he was that type of person, it feels like anyone who came across Paul Mariner has Paul Mariner stories. Obviously, you have a million Paul Mariner stories. And I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know you've had the opportunity to kind of, talk about Paul and remember Paul over the course of the past week or so. Is there any particular kind of Paul Mariner story you would want people to know that would kind of encapsulate his personality and kind of how you would want people to remember him?
Well, there are a couple, and I don't want to, I know you have other guests and discussions to get to, but, one thing I remember is that it was sort of, again, one of his sort of running jokes, and there were many of them, too many to catalog. You'd have to get all his teammates and former players together. But one thing he used to do when he would come in the morning to the Revs locker room, he was always watching everybody. His coaching style had as much to do with reading people and managing the group dynamic as it did with actual tactics on the field. So he was always watching what people were doing away from the field, how players interacted, during water breaks or on the team bus. Not that he was watching all of it. He had more of an eye on those things than you might have expected. He chose his seat, in the Revs office so that he could sort of see who was coming through the door together and when. Sometimes he'd make a snide remark about how a player was dressed, like Abdoulaye Mansali came in like orange camouflage, and with some choice words, he was sort of, what the blank is that? What kind of camouflage is in, that defeats the purpose of camouflage to wear safety orange camouflage, and and he called him Kenny, of course, and Mansali looked at him, and deadpan. He said, "Hey, coach, don't worry about it so much."
Yeah. Paul was really worried.
But Paul was like he liked that response. He's like, that means he's confident. He's not going to take crap from me on that, which was great. But the one he used to always do, he'd come in, and very often it would be, some of the rookies or reserve players sort of hang around the locker room, or he'd go to the lounge, and he'd lean in and he'd do an imitation of his former teammate at Portsmouth, Mick Channon, who's now a well-known horse trainer, and he'd say, "Morning, reserves," in that sort of Dorset, Southwest England accent, the sort of West Country accent, which is how Mick Channon speaks. And then he'd say, "They hate that, the reserves." And I think it's pretty obvious what it meant. But I was sort of like, don't you feel like you're a little hard on him? He's like, well, that's the point, right? Mick Channon used to come in at Portsmouth, and the reserves had a separate locker room, and he'd say, "Morning, reserves." And to him, that was a way to motivate everybody to do their best that day so that someday you join the first team. And so it ended up becoming sort of like a catch-all for a lot of things. But he would when you see him, he'd say, "Morning, reserves." And, he had a million of those tropes, those sort of catchphrases that signify that were their funny little running jokes, but they signify a lot more than the sort of pithy little anecdote might indicate. If you want to know a lot of those inside jokes, watch that movie Bostock's Cup. It's sort of the Spinal Tap of 70s English soccer. We had a lot of running jokes that came out of that, at the MLS Cup finals and on the plane. Stevie and Paul would have that running. Back then we used DVDs. They'd have the DVD going all the time. You can get it on YouTube now, but a lot of the jokes came from that. And, I don't know. Like, I could keep going. Like the way they used to prank the goalkeepers coaches. It was great for me because when we were between goalie coaches, I was the lightning rod for all the stuff, all the pranks and comments. But then when they had Davey Vinoli, or Gwyn Williams in there, or Pete Simonini too, like those guys they would bear the brunt. And like Vinoli, they changed out his shoes to a size smaller, and Vinoli's going out to warm up. Matt Reese, and he wore 12.5, but they didn't see that they swapped out. They wrote his initials on the back in the exact same handwriting. Another time, he covered Vinoli's locker with he would always like miss his armpit with baby powder, with the Gold Bond, and it would go on Vinoli's stuff, but it was accidentally on purpose. And finally, Vinoli flipped out and just like covered Paul's locker with powder, and Paul just didn't acknowledge it, put on his clothes with powder all over him, and just said, "Have a good one, guys," and walked out. He wasn't given the satisfaction because this is like he was, forged out of iron from, like a lot of the dressing rooms in lower league soccer when he played at Plymouth, and Chorley back in the 70s. Believe me, that was rougher than anything you run into, and it was a pretty spicy locker room for the Revolution mid 2000s. You had some big personalities in there, but nothing. Paul, came and you said it well, Jeff. Like he took everything very seriously, from being on time for the bus, anything to do with the game. He was all business and all about success. But he had a lighthearted sense of humor, and always, underneath the sort of, I don't want to call it hazing or cruelty, because it wasn't that. It was done out of love. You know what I mean? There was always a reason, a tender heart underneath it. And I think that, last thing that I'll say is I was very fortunate to get to see him before he passed, just, a few weeks before he passed, but when he was still in a state to be able to communicate. It was really hard to see him, really hard. And this is how I'm going to get choked up a little bit, because he was such a robust, such a titanic figure. And to see him, bedridden and diminished was, I felt it was important to do it. I was really fortunate to have the opportunity to do it, and for the family to give me that chance to see him. And he was able to communicate, even though he was, his battery was running low. Let's put it that way. And the thing that, maybe I had an hour and a half with him before he went back to sleep. And he didn't say a bad word about anybody. Even people that I used to hear him kid around about. He wanted to know how everybody's doing. Anybody who sent him good wishes, he had a good word to say back for me to pass back. And he was so happy to hear the Revs were doing well. We're in first place in the East. He was so happy to hear that guys like Clint and Charlie and Taylor had their great broadcasting careers going, and their families growing, and all these things. Tierney and Shawree were with the Reds front office, and it meant so much to him. And my takeaway was that when you strip back all of the sarcasm and the accents and the sort of rocker mentality underneath it, he's just a good-hearted guy who loved the sport, loved the clubs he was associated with, and like all the fan adulation, all the feeling that he got from his players and coaching colleagues and other colleagues in the business was reciprocated. It was a two-way street. And I think that, when you describe him at the front, Jeff, that's what we all felt. And that's the legacy he leaves. And even without him here, which is going to be hard for me, I want to text him about funny stuff having to do with the game all the time. But even without him here, the way he lived his life, the way he modeled behavior for all of us who are associated with this game we love, is that's the beacon he leaves behind, and that light won't burn out.
Yeah, I was going to ask to close how it is that you want people to remember Paul Mariner, but it feels like it's kind of all encapsulated there, especially in those moments that in his last moments, he still wanted to make sure that everything he said was a good word about someone and was positive, and that was Paul until the end.
That's it. That's it.
Brad, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm sure for years and years to come, we will continue to, every time any of us sit down together, we'll continue to share Paul Mariner stories. And that's probably the gift that he leaves all of us with, is we all have these stories that we will get to continue to tell to each other and to talk about Paul as we kind of have him live on within our own hearts and our own lives. So, Brad, thanks so much for taking the time, and we'll talk to you really soon.
Jeff, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brad. It's funny. Brad brings up the story about Kenny Mansali and Paul taking a little bit of a shot at his orange camo, and it jogged a memory of mine that I had completely forgotten about. But probably my first year with the team. So back in 2008, I'm just a communications coordinator. I'm terrified to be around anybody of stature because you're new and you don't want to mess up. And I had grown up watching the team, so I knew all about these guys. And I'm in the coach's office with Paul and Stevie before a game, and I think I was just wearing khakis and a polo. And Paul made a comment and was basically like, "Jeff, you look really sharp today." And to this day, I have no clue whether he actually thought I looked sharp or whether he was taking a shot at me. He was probably taking a shot at me, but it's like, well, I'm wearing a polo and khakis. Why? Like, one, why would I look good? Two, also, why would you take a shot? But it was just like, to this day, I'm like, I don't know. I don't know whether he was being genuine or whether he was taking a little shot. But that's just Paul.
Yeah, he was remarkable. I give Brad a lot of credit for getting through that. That's got to be tough for him. But yeah, I think we'll all have these little stories, right? And when I first joined the club, one of the first people I met was Paul, and I obviously grew up a big fan of English football. But Stevie Nicol being the coach was like, I'm like, oh my God, Stevie Nichol's the coach. And then and Paul Mariner, I remember watching videos like 101 great goals in these videos, and Paul Mariner, I'm like, this is great. And then you meet the guy, and it quickly becomes he's just Paul. He doesn't bring any of that stuff with him. He's just Paul. So you get comfortable with him just being Paul. And then we talked about this yesterday, Jeff, and then one of my first sort of, holy crap, who is this guy? It was like, we're walking in a tunnel, and you hear, Paul, hey, Paul, and he turns around, and Mick Jagger is running down the tunnel to hug him, and I'm like, that's Mick Jagger. I was like, well, that's just the circles Paul moved in, but you would never know in the second that he had this ability to make everybody feel like he'd always been your friend, and he always will be your friend, and you were the most important person he was talking to at that time. And like, I have whatever happens to the rest of my career, you talk about going in the coach's locker room match day. Like when Stevie and Paul were here, my match day would start about 6 hours before the kickoff with a cup of tea in Stevie's office with Paul Mariner, just talking about nonsense, about football and Ireland and stuff. And then we would kick the ball around the field for 5 minutes. And those are the things that are like, you look back in there and you're like, that was ridiculous. Yeah. But there was no barrier from him to you. It was just, we're all here working for the club, and we're all part of the same team, and this is cool. And he would just talk about everything, and you always felt like you were the most important person.
It's kind of my top level memory of Paul, and as I was jotting down a few notes for the show, that was the first thing that I wrote down, was that we talk about the accolades that Paul Mariner achieved in this sport and the legend that he was within the game. We talk about scoring at a World Cup and being someone who potentially could have had a knighthood, who was dubbed Sir Paul in England. And you mentioned the kind of the circles that he ran in, but just in terms of his stature within the game of football, and I'll call it football obviously for the sake of Paul, in chatting with him about the game, his level of knowledge and his experience in that game so far overshadows any knowledge I could ever have of this game. His experiences, his knowledge of the game absolutely dwarf mine in every way. But when we talked about the game, he never used that as a reason why his opinion would matter more than yours.
No.
Every conversation with him was on the level. You were having a face-to-face conversation, and your opinion about the game mattered just as much as his opinion about the game, and it did not matter who you were.
Yeah, that you're spot on. And you would talk about, different players or formations and stuff, and he would listen intently to you like you actually had a valid opinion versus his, right? And you would debate stuff with him, and he would always have that conversation, that debate with you about everything. And it's just crazy when you think about it, that he would tolerate that level of conversation. And like you just think of the impact, like in our club and talent evaluation and the players that came to this club under his watch, right? And the list is massive of the amount of, you look at these records out in the hall outside the walls here and how many people that Nickel and Mariner brought in, right? And he would talk to you about, what did you think about Michael Parkhurst? I'm like, I don't have a valid opinion on what I thought about, but you would talk about it, and he would be like, oh yeah, that's interesting. And you're like he just had that ability to always sort of connect, right? And from the first second I met him until the last time I spoke to him, you were just his friend. That's just who you were. You weren't the guy who worked for the club. You weren't anybody other than his friend. And that's sort of his magic ability that he had. And he got obviously, I had a son, right? And he knew Oliver liked to play soccer, and he would always ask about him. And I can't remember the road trip we were on. Paul was in the broadcast booth at this point, and I was on a FaceTime with Ollie, just checking in from the road. And Paul just was walking by and sat in beside me and was like saying hello, and he's like talking away to Ollie and asking about his game, and he says, Oliver, I'll give you one word of advice. And he's like, always have the ball with you, no matter where you go. Always have the ball. And Ollie's like, okay, all right, okay. Flash forward like a week later, and you're in the kitchen, and Ollie's kicking the ball around the kitchen. I'm like, Ollie, no, we talked about this. No ball upstairs. The ball's in the playroom. He's like, Paul told me.
Hey, Paul said.
Always have the ball. And you know what, Dad? Paul played at the World Cup. I'm like,
he's got a valid point.
Okay, fair enough. I can't argue.
He's got a valid point. I mean, you talk about magnetic personalities. I mean, Paul had the definition of a magnetic personality. And I know Brad touched on it. Carl, you've already touched on it. But Paul really did. It's an incredible ability to make someone else feel important. And Paul had this incredible ability when he was talking with you to make you feel like you were the most important person in the room.
Yep.
And that, to me, is one of the most incredible personality traits that someone can have, is to make other people feel special. And Paul had this incredible ability to make other people feel special.
Brad and I were sort of joking a little bit about it yesterday, that there's been about 15 former players that have come out and said, Paul was my best friend.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Everybody feels like he's your best friend. And it feels sort of, I've struggled with this a little bit, and how emotional I should be about this news, right? Because, I've known Paul for 16 years, right? But it's not like we were close, right? Like we're friends around this club, but you do feel like that you've experienced this great loss, and I kind of wrestle a little bit because I'm like, I don't have the right to get too emotional about it, but it's hard not to, because you think about him and you hear his laugh and you see that smile. And when it gets sad is when you think you won't see that again. But then you're like, if he knew we were sitting here getting emotional, he would be so pissed off with us. So you're like, I don't have the right to do that. So you focus on all those things that made us laugh and smile. And yes, they're the things we're going to miss the most about him, but they're also the things that you got to focus on and you got to remember. And that's the legacy he's going to leave behind for all the clubs and all the people and everyone he touched and came across his path. Is your instant reaction when you think about Paul Mariner is to smile.
My goodness.
Exactly. And that will, it's tough and it's hard and it's sad, but it's also, that's the light he's left behind, right? And it's up to us to sort of take that when we remember him.
You mentioned the laugh too. It's funny because there are not a lot of people whose laughs I can immediately conjure up in my head and immediately know what it sounds like.
Yep.
And if you ever heard Paul Mariner laugh, you know what it sounds like, and it was unmistakable. When you heard that laugh, you knew Paul was in the room. What an unbelievable laugh. And it makes sense that a guy with that personality would have the laugh that he had.
Yeah. We'd go on the road and be like in the press box in another stadium, and you'd hear him laugh like all the way down, not knowing where. You don't have your bearings in an opposing team stadium, but you'd hear it down in the broadcast booth, wherever it may be. Be like, all right, Paul and Brad are here. Easy to go find them. because they're having a blast as he usually did.
It's amazing. I mean, like, and Brad touching it with people. It's sort of surreal, right? Because we think of him as our friend. We don't think of him as Paul Mariner, the international soccer star. But then you see the tributes, and you see the level of person that is remembering Paul and eulogizing Paul, and it just feels odd, right? You're not used to hearing, people like a Gary Lineker talk about your friend, right?
Yeah.
And that's what it feels like. It feels like we've all lost a friend, not that the football world lost Paul Mariner, that we all individually lost Paul. Like, the club lost him, Arsenal lost him, Plymouth lost him, England lost him, football lost him, but also Jeff lost him, and Jason lost him, and Curtis lost him, and I lost him, and that's what makes this so such a unique feeling in this time.
I want to tell a story about Paul too. Everybody's got Paul stories, and this is the story that I kind of remember Paul by. It was 2016. We're in Vancouver for a road game. It's an afternoon road game. Brad and Paul are set to call the game that afternoon in Vancouver. I'm in bed, morning of the game. We're sleeping in a little bit because it's the morning of the game. I don't have to be up too early. It's 9 a.m. I'm awake, but I'm still in bed, and my phone rings, and it's Adam Kleonski in our PR department, which is never usually a good sign when your phone rings 9 a.m. morning of the game and the PR guy is calling you. So I answer the phone, with trepidation. I'm like, well, what's wrong? And he's like, hey, Brad might make it to the game, but he's coming from Europe. There have been a couple delays to his flight. There's a possibility he doesn't make it to the game this afternoon. Would you be comfortable stepping in and doing play-by-play on today's television broadcast? And now you would think that the reaction to that might be, oh man, an opportunity to step in and do play-by-play on today's television broadcast. Yeah, awesome. But you have to understand that to normally build up to something like that, you would call 10 games on tape to get a feel for how you would call play-by-play. You would do games on the radio. You would do Open Cup games. You would do friendlies. You would build up to live television broadcast of doing play-by-play, and I had done none of that. So my immediate reaction was,
nope.
Oh, no, thank you. I do not want to be on live television this afternoon calling this game. So Adam hangs up. He says, no problem. We'll talk to you later. Yeah, I kind of shut my eyes again. Phone rings 2 minutes later. It's Adam again. He says, hey, I'm down in the lobby with Paul. Paul just wants you to come down, and he just wants to chat with you. He just wants to talk. You don't have to do the game, but Paul just wants you to come down and talk. And my immediate reaction, I'm like, Adam, I cannot go down there. If I go down there, he's going to convince me to do it. There's absolutely no way. I am coming out of a conversation with Paul Mariner, telling him no, that I am not comfortable calling this game with him. And Adam's just like, he's just insistent that you come down and chat with him. So, of course, I hang up the phone, and I'm like, well, that's that. So put on clothes, go down to the lobby, and Paul spent maybe 5-10 minutes just being Paul, telling me, hey, this is... I know you'd be nervous about it, but it's absolutely nothing. We don't even, the hit that we do pregame, it's not even live. You can do it as many times as you want to. We're just going to sit there for 90 minutes and talk about soccer. You know this team. I'm going to be there with you. It's going to be a ton of fun. You know how to do this. And of course, within 5 minutes, I'm leaving the table going, yeah, if you can't find anyone else to do it,
I got this.
I'll do it with you. Now, Brad ended up landing in Vancouver on time. He called the game. I did not call the game alongside Paul Mariner. Oh no, now looking back, what an experience that would have been for me to have on my reel, calling a match with Paul Mariner alongside me. I probably should have jumped at the opportunity, but in that moment I was terrified.
Yep.
But it was Paul who was there to unterrify me, and I knew that he would have the capability to do that. I knew that the moment they said Paul just wants to talk to you about doing the game, that there was no way in hell I was going to be able to say no to Paul Mariner, and I couldn't say no.
Right.
So that's my Paul Mariner story.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think some of my favorite interactions with him was when Jessie Cofield was with us, and she was a sideline reporter, but her and Paul used to do a kind of, this is before the pregame live days, they used to do like a mini 3 or 4 minute live hit on our Twitter and Facebook, literally from a phone. But Paul would wear some sort of his sport coat, and he would always have this just insane
the lining
in there. But none of us would ever really saw it until we were live. So he'd be like, what do you got going on? He'd be like, and then get on there, and Jesse'd be like, all right, what we got today, Paul? And, just like, look at this. Like, and he had that, that confidence that like Brad was talking about, like that swagger, but at the same time, he knew it was over the top and it was funny, but it was also like, nobody else has this because I have it, and, this is super cool. And just the way those two interacted, and just, being able to do that every game with him, and, we just kind of build up to it after like, stuffing our faces with dinner before the match was going to start. It was all, that's kind of one of, my favorite memories, even though that was on the later part. There's definitely some from the earlier part when he was coaching too. Like, I do remember one, and it's funny that Kenny Mansally got brought up because I think he and Kenny had kind of a weird relationship. So I definitely remember the camo thing, but I also remember one time Kenny was late for getting out to warm-ups for a game, and Paul ran warm-ups with all the players. So I see Kenny kind of go past me in the tunnel. He gets out, he jumps over the field board, and Paul just looks at him, and I've never seen Paul like this angry. Like, the smile just went away from his face. He looked at him, he pointed to his wrist and said something I can't repeat. And it's just like, whoa. I'd never seen angry Coach Paul, but that was angry Coach Paul.
It gets to your point right about his attitude. His carefree demeanor was not reflected in how he coached or how he prepared or how he did anything, right? There was just, he was great. Like, and we could sit here and tell a million stories. Like,
sure.
The second he heard I was a Liverpool fan, he started regaling me about stories about playing at Anfield and who was the toughest Liverpool defender he ever played against. And my jaw was on the floor listening to it. And it's not because I asked him to do it. I didn't go in there and say, hey, talk to me about Liverpool. Yeah. He just did, because he knew that's what I wanted to hear. And we just did. And he would always greet me with this over-exaggerated Dublin, all right. Like, every time, all right. Every time he saw me, like, he's just the best. He's just the best.
He really was. And when I remember when he left in 2009 to take over at Plymouth Argyle, and I had sent him a note just wishing him the best and essentially saying, hey, I know I came in these past 2 years as this really green communications coordinator, had no clue what I was doing, and you kind of welcomed me with open arms and how much I appreciated that. And in his response, he called me a diamond geezer, which I had taken with me I will never forget that phrase, diamond geezer, which essentially just meant, just a good dude if you're a diamond geezer. Yep. But now I always think of that because that was the phrase Paul used. Anytime I think anybody's a good guy, he's a diamond geezer.
Yep.
And yeah, I guess I kind of close by just saying I think Paul left all of us with, we mentioned he left us with all of these memories and these stories that we can tell, and he's left us with 1 million sound bites on our soundboard that we will continue to use because it just makes us happy to hear Paul's voice.
It does, and like I had to like pick which ones. I only have 8 slots here, and I was like, wow, which one did I enjoy the most? We just go through these and just.
I saw his very, very shiny shoes. That's why I remember him so.
Like, he just had this way about him, even in the broadcast booth, and he just say these things that, like, I don't know how he thinks of these, but they're just so entertaining and so Paul and so just so good.
Shenanigans, a little bit of hanky-panky going on in that box.
I mean, some of his best reactions to goals were to just laugh.
Yeah.
If there was an unbelievable goal, he would just start laughing, and you knew exactly what emotion he was conveying, having seen that goal.
Yeah,
and laughing with that laugh.
He just loved the game, and he loved coaching it. He loved talking about it. He loved broadcasting it. He just loved being around the game, and it's infectious. And he's just one of those. He's just a magical sort of one of a kind guy, and he'll be missed.
My biggest lesson that I will take from Paul, at least that I will try to take from Paul, because he did it better than anyone, is to go forward trying to treat absolutely everyone that you come in contact with respect and find joy in everything. I know it's so cliche. It is so cliche to say, oh, he found joy in everything. But Paul Mariner was the definition of finding joy in everything.
Yeah, and look, and that's the example of the sort of legacy you want to leave behind, right? What Paul left here didn't cost him anything more than time. Like, he didn't invest anything in it other than just his personality, and he's left behind this legacy where we're all better people for having known Paul. And I think it's little small things that, you're right, Jeff, that we should all take from him is that, yes, it's treating everybody with respect, but it's treating everybody with kindness and happiness and approaching everybody from a position of embrace and not standoffishness, which we tend to do, and that's certainly what I will try to move forward with, as a tribute to him. And it's on tributes. If you're coming on 7:25, we will take a moment as a club to pause and remember Paul as well. So if you're coming that day, you'll get a chance to pay your own respects.
I guess I'll put this out to the group. Like you said, we could sit here and talk about Paul all day, and we've already talked about Paul for close to an hour. So there's part of me that feels like Paul wouldn't want us spending an entire show talking just about him.
No, because we're not talking about football.
So I do have a few, current Revs topics. Do we want to stop here and leave it at a whole show about Paul, or do we want to hit a couple of Revs topics to kind of almost honor Paul and have part of the show also be about the game?
I think if Paul were here, he would tell us to talk
about
football. That's enough about me.
Oh, thank you.
Enough about Paul.
Thank you for that. Let's move on. Yeah, so I almost in that sense to honor Paul, because he wouldn't want to spend in so long talking about him. Let's finish up with a little bit of Revs talk, which we haven't had a chance to do in quite a while. I'll start by this. Of course, as we get back on the Far Post podcast, it says the Revs hit that first little blip in results that they've had really all season.
Yeah.
But look, the Revs are 7-3-3, first place in the Eastern Conference, 5-1-0 at home. They've taken points from 5 of 7 road games. It is 24 points. That's very good math. It's been a long time since you've done that kind of math.
Yeah. And plus, they switched now the ties and the draws, so I had to. They're doing it right now.
Yeah. So at 7-3-3, it shouldn't have thrown you off too much.
No, but
since the wins or the losses and draws are the same.
I did have to think about it for a second, because they are doing it correctly now.
Did.
Yeah.
But look, by all accounts, it has been a fantastic start to the 2021 season for the Revolution. So in that sense, as we now talk about, yes, they've hit this first little blip, the last 3 games, 2 losses and a draw. What should be, and I know this is not what you typically do on podcasts or the internet or Twitter, because we've seen plenty of irrational reaction, of course. What should be the rational reaction to this first little blip of results?
The rational reaction should be to put it in context and say, would you have settled for 24 points after 13 games of the season? You probably would have.
Probably.
Right?
It's first place in the East, so you should probably take it.
So the rational response is, we would have been happy with where we are. That's what you should do. But that's not what people do, right? And the fan is short for fanatic, and there's a reason for that, right? We're invested, and the fans have, it's sort of that tricky, the double-edged sword, right? The better you get, the higher the expectation. And I certainly said it going into the home game against Toronto, that if we're as good as we think we are, then this is a game we should win handily, and we should dispatch this team. And you end up losing that, and that's sort of like that's frustrating. So, yeah. And I think it's timely, right? When you talk to Vandenberg, and he was like, "We're going to find out what sort of team we are, and how we respond to this will help us figure out what kind of team we are." And that's where, as I text you after the game, it's a very MLS-y result, right? That, you see these things in MLS where a team that's just got smashed and fired their coach and comes in to play a first-place team on the road, hasn't a shot, and they're 3-0 up inside 25 minutes. And you're like, well, it's very MLS, right?
That's what I said before. I was like,
and you would
team lost their coach, MLS.
Yeah, you would hope you get to a point where you're sort of MLS proof, right? The good teams tend to be MLS proof, and that's what you would hope to be. So it's a big test coming up to respond there and rebound. And the Columbus point, that's a great result.
It's a good point.
That's a great result.
Obviously, there's disappointment when you're up 2-0 inside 30 minutes and you don't come away with 3 points. But on the face of it, that is a good point, certainly under the circumstances.
Playing against that team and that environment, that's you would have ripped somebody's arm off for a point before the game. So you'll take that point. That's a good result. And then you gotta put the other 2 in context and say we gotta get better. Like those can't happen, and the sort of the nature of some of the goals we conceded, and but it's I think breaks like this tend to be good for Bruce Arena coach teams to sort of reset, and they come out of those strong usually. So we'll see. We're going to find out, right? This is, again, another tough environment we're going into this weekend. Granted, they're struggling a little bit. They have some choppy results of their own, but it's not an easy place to go at all. So we'll see. We'll see what we're made of. But overall, to get back to your original question, we have to be happy. We have to be happy with what we've seen. We have arguably the best player in the league at the moment, playing at a remarkable level. I don't even have to say his name. He's playing that well.
Yeah, he's pretty good.
You know, he's legitimately made me get out of my seat a couple of times this year with some of the things he's done, and that's
You get that guttural reaction when something
like,
happens. You go,
oh! Like I think it was back-to-back games. He pulled a ridiculous piece of control,
Just making
and you're
players
like,
fall
oh my
down.
God, like he's just at a level that's just off the charts, and we have a goalkeeper who's performing at a level that we're used to good goalkeepers here in New England, right? We certainly had one for a decade in Matt Reese, but what Matt Turner's doing, some of the saves he's making, so you have all these positive stories in a really deep squad, and you have someone like a Boateng comes off the bench and looks great, and you're like, oh, I forgot we had that game. Really. So you have all these pieces, and you're starting to get healthy, and Mafla and Captum and all these pieces, and you're going to see the full squad in place. So yeah, if you're not happy with where we are, then you probably should reevaluate. But it's okay to be frustrated with the Toronto result.
Yeah, of course. And the other side of that too, when you talk about MLSE results, it's very MLSE in general that the Revs are 7-3-3, have 3 losses on the season, and 2 of those losses were to the last place team in the West and the last place team in the East. Now that's kind of its own whole separate thing because, like you said, when you have aspirations of being one of the best teams in the league, those are the types of games that you can't be losing.
Yep.
But it is also very MLSE that would be the case. Your first place team with 3 losses on the year, 2 of those losses have been to last place teams. That just kind of makes sense for Major League Soccer. But we talked about even when the Revs were on the 5-game winning streak, we kind of always left in the background. Look, they're not going to win every game for the rest of the year. There are going to be little bumps in the road. It's Major League Soccer. It's a 34-game season. It's a league built on parity. There are going to be little blips in terms of results. It's a matter of how quickly can you put an end to that? How do you respond to that? You know, a good team, okay, might have a little 3-game blip, but you're not going to have a 4-game blip, a 5-game blip, a 6-game blip. So that's kind of where we are. It does feel like it's a little bit of that kind of that make or break situation where you're like, all right, what kind of team are you going to be now that you've hit that little blip?
Yeah, for sure, and that's why, there's no must not lose games in July. It's not that level of game, but it is a test. It's an early test for these guys to figure out, what's their resolve, and can they look at that 3-game stretch and nip it in the bud, and they've regrouped now for a week or so and go and get a result and go start playing again, right? And that's the test. So we'll see. I think they are. I think I've seen enough of them and sort of the depth of the squad and the personalities on the team, and obviously the head coach. And I think there's enough about them to be able to put an end to it. But we'll see.
And certainly, I mean, you look at these last 5 games or so, the Revs know that defensively it hasn't been good enough.
Yeah.
You concede multiple goals in 5 straight games. That's not going to be sustainable over the course of a season. The Revs know that. Bruce Arena was asked about that on today's media conference and essentially said, yeah, we know we need to get better there, but when you look at some of the goals they've conceded, they've come down to these momentary individual mistakes, which he's kind of saying, if we're going to be conceding goals, I'd almost rather concede goals that way because those are easily correctable. Yeah. That's not a shape issue. That's not a
system
team issue.
Breakdown. Yeah.
That's a mistake in that moment.
Yep.
And we can fix those.
Yep.
So it is certainly concerning to concede multiple goals in 5 straight games, but the manner of the goals have been kind of such individual errors that you feel like, well, okay, if you can correct those, you could be okay.
Yeah, because I think other than the New York City game, where Matt Turner stands in his head, right? And they had a tough day defensively that day, but it doesn't feel to me, at least anecdotally, that they're getting carved up game in, game out, and the teams are missing chances, and they're doing okay. They're just you can't legislate for the types of errors we've seen, right? That's just momentary lapses in concentration from players and mistakes from individual mistakes. So yeah, it's not as concerning as with Cincinnati. I think it conceded 5 set-piece goals in a game.
In a single game,
That's a problem, right? When you ship 5 set-piece goals in the same game, you have a problem that you can fix on the coaching, right, on the training ground.
Great work, everyone. Well done.
All right.
I think Chris Tierney scored one of those free kicks, actually.
So I don't think it's Bruce is correct in that it's not sort of panic stations. It's it's each individual making sure they're switched on and get back to doing what we were doing when we were playing well, right? And get back to dominating the ball and getting it to your good players and testing people and dragging people out of position. And that's we'll get back to it. I'm not concerned.
There are going to be a lot of opportunities to get back to it because there are a lot of soccer games coming up.
A lot of games
soccer.
coming. A lot of games.
Whole lot of soccer.
In a
coming
weird
up.
schedule.
The Revs are going to play 6 games in the next 23 days. They're going to play, I think it's 6 in July, 6 in August, 6 in September. I mean, 6 is normally a lot of games for a single month.
Yeah.
When you do it in 3 straight months, it's a whole lot of games. So
a lot.
My question before we move on and finish up with a little bit of Gold Cup talk is as you look ahead to this summer stretch and kind of the rest of the season, and you think about where the Revs are now, what are the biggest questions for you that you're looking forward to kind of seeing answered as we move forward into the deeper summer months?
I mean, you just hit on one of them with cleaning up the sort of defensive, cleaning up the goals, right? Cleaning up that area. I would like to see us get to sort of full health at some point, right? We haven't really seen Captoon what he can do yet. We haven't seen Mafla at all, right? So I'd like to see those guys get in and then see what the full depth of the squad is. It's going to be tested, right? We know that with the run of games we have coming up, that there's going to be rotation. There's going to have to be. So it'll be interesting to see how all the spots get filled. We'll see a little bit of it now with obviously Turner and Buchanan being away. And we've sort of seen little bits of that. We mentioned Boateng getting into the game, right? May not have happened otherwise. But I think that's sort of what I want to see. We want to see get the full squad and see it all gel together. And then is there something approaching a settled lineup? That's the hard part when you got this run of games because you have to rotate people. So it's tough to say, well, this should be the starting 11 because you can't play the same team 3 times in 8 days, and that's going to keep occurring. So it's going to be good to see that squad get up to full fitness and be able to see it all work together and cover this insane period.
I think we're in a run of games right now where I think probably 6 or 7 straight games at this point. There's been 3 changes every single game. And so you've kind of almost come to expect at this point that there are going to be 3 changes from game to game.
Yep.
I was going to say, I'd like to see Adam Brooks' shots just, stop running into that bad luck. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yep.
Like he's putting them on point. They're
On the positive side, though, he's a shoo-in for the crossbar challenge at the All-Star.
This is true.
I mean, it's kind of beyond parody at this point.
It's crazy.
Every time it happens that Buxa hits the woodwork, you're like, can't have happened again.
No.
I've never seen anything like that maybe in one season, but for back-to-back seasons,
it's crazy.
For Buxa to be leading the league and hitting the woodwork just seems
he's in good spots.
Crazy.
He's always there. He scores goals, but he just could have so many more. Just run into that.
And part of one of the questions that I am looking forward to seeing answered, and obviously I think a lot of Revolution fans are looking forward to seeing answered, is through the early part of the season, we have kind of seen a bit of rotation between Bo and Buxa because the way that the team has been set up a lot of the time has called for a single number 9, a single forward, and both Bo and Buxa have kind of shown that that's where they had fit in best to the group. Now we saw last game go back to a 2-forward setup with Bo and Buxa alongside each other. We know that they can play together. They can get Bo and Buxa on the field together at the same time. I'm interested to see whether there's going to be a little bit of continued rotation between those two or if they're going to figure out a way to get all of those guys on the field together, and if they do, what that looks like.
I mean, you would hope they figure out a way to get them all on the field together, right? You want your three DPs to play. So it's encouraging, or I'm encouraged that we've seen it a little in the last couple of games, and maybe some of that's forced with Buchanan not being here, that you can look at different ways to play. But yeah, ideally you want to get to a point where those 3 guys are on the field and all contributing, right? And Carlos is consistently contributing all the time, right? And the other 2 are sort of when one's on, one's not, or can they get going at the same time? Can they fire at the same time? So, and I think they can do it, and we've seen flashes of it, and maybe this is a period for them to be able to get comfortable with each other. But that's where you want to get to, right? You don't want your DPs set up where one of them is on the bench all the time.
Yeah. And my other question, you mentioned with the rotation, there's going to be rotation. We've seen rotation, but my question is we have seen some guys who've consistently been in the lineup through the 13 games, guys like Farrell and Heel and Polster, By, Jones. At what point, if at all, are those guys going to get a rest? And how do you kind of maneuver through that of picking your spots when to give a couple of those guys a rest? Because it's going to be tough for those guys to go through a 34-game schedule the way that it is constituted and continuously play at top form over 34
Yeah,
games.
and look, I think the trickiest one of the whole lot of those is Farrell, right? Because if Mafla's back in training, right? Let's say Mafla can play, then left back for left back is not too traumatic, right? You can use Jones to spot by on the right if you need to, or
Play
you
AJ
can,
De La Garza.
You can play De La Garza, right? Polster, if you get Captoon back up to full fitness, there's players there. Scotty Caldwell still there. You have options there where you don't really have the same level of confidence as at centre back, right? And we haven't seen Bell and Kessler play together yet. So that's the trickiest one, I think, to figure out is what is a spot if you need to give Andrew Farrell a break, what's the game you're picking to throw two relatively inexperienced defenders in together? That's a tricky one, right? You probably want to wait until Matt Turner's back to marshal the back line, right, if you're going to do that. But that's the rest I think you have opportunities to do that with without impacting your shape too much. But the Farrell one's a real question mark. That's a big leap to take someone with that much experience off the field and replace him with guys that have relatively little.
All right, and lastly, I know we're probably well over the time that we had planned, but
Classic
gotta-
podcast
Well,
format.
See what happens when I come back?
especially talking. I mean, we spent we like I said, we could have gone forever on Paul, but
Yes.
we must mention, as we've touched upon briefly, both Tejan Buchanan and Matt Turner,
Matt Turner's Twitter handle is @HeadTurner.
just in case you'd forgotten. In action at the CONCACAF Gold Cup with Canada and the United States, respectively. And obviously here in Foxborough, as we've talked about, the Revs are working through how to compensate for the loss of two pretty big pieces of the puzzle throughout the month of July. But it's also, for us, it's a heck of a lot of fun to watch these guys on the international stage. It's a fantastic opportunity for them. And Tejan Buchanan kicked things off with Canada. Went the full 90 minutes in their opener, set up a pair of goals in Canada's 4-1 win over Martinique. He terrorized Martinique.
Outrageous pieces of skill.
Terrorized Martinique down that left side. He had a bit of skill that went a little bit viral where he flicks
filthy.
the ball up to himself on the sideline.
Filthy.
And I mean, the thing that I guess I want to say about Tejan is it does legitimately feel like right now, every time he steps on the field, he is getting better. It feels like his improvement is exponential game over game right now.
Yeah, no doubt. And whatever happened, and whenever he decided to flip the switch and decided in his own head that he can take on anybody who's in front of him, he's just gone. And he's gone from strength to strength and is growing. And I think we saw flashes of it in his first year, and there was a little bit of inconsistency with the end product. And you're like, what is this guy and what is he? And then the second he sort of figured out that he could beat whoever he wants, now it's just get him the ball and he's just going to go. And it's exciting. Like, I don't know if we like, obviously Carlos is a different bucket of type of player, but to think about just out and out, get the ball and take people on wingers that we've had, right? It's pretty cool to watch. But you're right, he's just going leaps and bounds. And now on an international stage, he's still like got the confidence to just go. Right? That's great.
I feel like we used to talk a lot about Diego Fagundez being a player who thrived on confidence and required confidence to be at his best. Tejan Buchanan is definitely one of those guys who has to have confidence to be at his best. And right now, he looks pretty darn confident.
Yeah, he does. He's like, get him the ball and get out of the way. Let him go.
Yeah, and look at the way the league is set up now. Tejan Buchanan, unsurprisingly, he's a player who's going to have European rumors swirling. But right now, he's a big piece of what the Revs are doing in New England. He's a ton of fun to watch. I'm looking forward to continuing to watch him with Canada, and then looking forward to get him back in New England for the stretch run here, because he's a huge piece of the puzzle. And then finally, Matt Turner. He had a little less to do in the U.S. national team's 1-0 win over Haiti, but he was steady, made 3 saves to keep his second straight clean sheet to begin his U.S. men's national team career. I think most importantly, Matt Turner now cap-tied to the United States. He had the opportunity to represent Lithuania. I suppose technically he could still file for his one-time switch, but we don't see that. He's
I don't
a
foresee
U.S.
that,
national team goalkeeper.
Yes.
And look, this is Twitter, right? As we talk about rational and irrational reactions, there was at least a small segment of Twitter who were probably Zach Steffen fans who were looking to be critical of Matt Turner and kind of latched on to his passing out of the back because there was probably one moment where maybe he didn't make the right decision. Maybe very, just a little shaky, and all of a sudden people jump on that and go, well, he can't play out of the back. You can't be the national team goalkeeper. And it's like, all right, everybody calm down. His distribution over space, over distance is fantastic.
Yeah.
He's still getting better. His distribution on the ground is fine.
Yeah.
And he's continuing to improve. This is a player still very new to the game of soccer, still very new to goalkeeping, and we've seen him improve day over day, game over game, and he's going to continue to do that with the ball at his feet.
Yeah, but he doesn't have that much approval to go. That's the point. I think they latched on to such a small piece of that. I tried to, as I ended up thinking about, did I miss something? Did I go away for 5 minutes where he gave up the ball 3 times and they almost conceded? Maybe it is just Zach Steffen fans, I don't know, or people that don't want Matt Turner to be the goalkeeper, but I think it's pretty apparent that Berhalter is making peace with the fact that the strong parts of Matt Turner's game may outweigh the fact that he might not be as comfortable on the ball as Zach Steffen is. Because ultimately his job is to save the ball. And there are very few in this country that can do it to the level he can.
Yeah. And for me, too, I even look at the flip side of it, of looking at how he's going to improve with the ball at his feet. You mentioned his distribution with the ball at his feet is fine. But I think he's going to continue to just get better and better because the attitude that we've seen from him and the growth that we have seen over the course of the past 3 years is what has gotten him to this level in terms of going out on the training ground every day and having this attitude where he feels like he has to improve himself. He has to prove himself, and he has to get better, and he has to get better, and he has to get better. I think he's going to take that to heart with knowing that if right now, the way the U.S. national team is constituted in Greg Berhalter's system, the keeper has to be comfortable with the ball at his feet. He's going to say, fine, I'm going to work every single day on being as comfortable as possible with the ball at my feet.
Sure.
And I think you're going to continue to see that improvement.
There are no concerns with Matt Turner being your goalkeeper. None.
No.
We are just anyone who's
he literally has never conceded a goal in a U.S. national team jersey.
There are no concerns at all. None.
Yeah. All right, well, as we move forward with that competition, Canada play Haiti on Thursday night. Of course, as we record on Thursday, it's by the time people listen to this, people have probably that game has probably already happened. The U.S. play Martinique, and then the two countries, the U.S. and Canada, meet in the group finale on Sunday, 5 p.m. Eastern time. That game's on Big Fox.
Big Fox.
Yeah, it's a big one. Tajon Buchanan versus Matt Turner, so we'll certainly be tuned into that one from a New England Revolution perspective.
Yeah.
That's gonna be a tough one for me because I'm not sure I've ever remember watching a U.S. national team game where part of me sort of cheering for one of the guys on the other team. That's going to be tough. I'm obviously a U.S. national team fan. I want the U.S. national team to win. I don't want Turner to concede a goal.
Right.
But if Tajon does something well, I might have a little golf clap off to the side.
Yeah. It's going to be fun.
All right. Well,
I do know the U.S. are going to have to play a whole lot better than they did in the last game.
Lot better against Canada for sure.
Yeah.
A lot better against Canada than they did in the opener against Haiti.
Not great.
Well, I know it's been kind of a whirlwind of a show, but that'll do it for this week's installment of the Far Post podcast presented by Esports Gaming League. It was great to have you guys back. It felt like a very fitting show, obviously, for us to kind of come back together and celebrate the life and legacy of Paul Manor. And thank you so much to Brad Feldman for joining us as well. Look, we hope that we did Paul justice today, and I think as a tribute to Paul, what all of us can do is, and all of the listeners as well, go out and be kind to people. Smile, laugh, joke. That's what Paul would want us to do. Paul would be happy to know that he had left people with those lessons and it inspired people to do that. So go out, live your life like Paul Mariner would, and we'll see you next time on the Far Post podcast presented by Esports Gaming League.